The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
we are now about to witness the truth.
It's the Benjamin Dixon Show.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I am your host, Benjamin Dixon. It is Thursday, January 4th, 2018. Thanks so much for joining us. We will be listening to you in the comment sections and on Facebook, YouTube, as well as Twitter to see what you have to say about the conversation this morning. There's a lot happening in the news, and I only have time to cover about 3 topics this morning. As always, we want you to weigh in on the discussion and join the conversation, as everyone always says, by leaving your comments. Let's start with, first, patrons. Thanks so much for being a patron. If you like the Benjamin Dixon Show and you listen on a regular basis, as many of you do, go to patreon.com/the BPD Show and become a patron today. Someone in the comment section yesterday asked whether or not I'm going to go ahead and push forward with the podcast on being a black Christian in a white evangelical America. The answer is yes, but as with everything else, I need to make sure that I can fit it into a schedule that I can consistently do it. And as soon as I get that schedule created where I can consistently every week deliver a podcast, because I think it's very important with a lot of the things that are happening in the news. There's a lot of confusion and questions that surround many Christians, many black people who are Christians and realize that their politics 100% do not line up with that of white evangelicals who currently support Donald Trump. Now, I would argue and say that we should have exposed this a long time ago. I've known that there's a great divide between being a black Christian in America and being a white conservative evangelical Christian in America. Our goals are almost diametrically opposed in many regards. I've known that for quite some time, but it seems that the election of Donald Trump has exacerbated that divide, or not even the divide as much as exposed how different it is. We're almost so different. It's almost as though we're all worshiping different gods. And that's why I think the podcast is extremely important. But as with everything else, I need to make sure that I can fit it into my hectic schedule, my schedule that is extremely hectic. So in terms of the news for today, I want to talk about Keith Ellison. And he freaked everybody the hell out. Not only conservatives. I put conservatives in the description. He didn't only freak out conservatives. He freaked out a lot of liberals because of a picture that he shared of him with a book with an Antifa, or however the hell you pronounce it. Everybody seems to have different opinions. Let's just say an anti-fascist book he took a picture with, and everybody freaked the hell out. Fox News, as well as some liberals. I also want to talk about Chris Kobach and this voter commission, fraud commission that was disbanded by the president. The president had a few things to say about it this morning. And I also want to go to some international news and talk about Iceland's new policy on equal pay and how they intend to keep and hold people accountable, hold corporations and companies accountable for ensuring that men and women are paid equal amounts. So just saying good morning to everyone in the chat room. Hey, everyone, I see you there. Let's take a look at Facebook, see the chat room over there. And as always, also want you to listen to the podcast version of this. If you're listening live, you're listening via YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. But there's also a podcast version of this that is available for your download almost a few minutes after the show, right? All right, so let's talk about this voter fraud commission. So one thing that Republicans believe in more than anything else, the one thing they believe in more than anything else is that somehow millions upon millions of black people or non-white people or non-conservatives get in vans every single election and travel across borders of states, into the millions, right? And vote in an election that they're not legally allowed to vote in. They believe in this so much. I want to set it up for you. November 7th number 6 was the election last year. I went to a Tea Party debate in Providence, Rhode Island. Oh no, it was in Worcester, Massachusetts, that I went to a Tea Party debate, and as you could imagine, it was quite a time. And we were arguing back and forth, debating back and forth. And I found it fascinating that I could get that group of people who voted for Donald Trump and were elated and just excited about everything. I got them to believe in racism in that 2 hour, hour and a half that we sat there. I got them to understand and even agree to the fact that they were, if they weren't racist, they were racist adjacent. They were okay with the amount of racism that Donald Trump was peddling. I got them to agree to that. You know what I couldn't get them to agree with? That voter fraud is as rare as being struck by lightning. Statistically, you have a higher chance of getting struck by lightning than you do actually finding cases of voter fraud. And some of the cases, the few cases that we have seen, have been Republicans who are doing it. But they believe, as a matter of faith, as a statement of faith, that millions of black people get in church vans. What's the shield? What's that guy name that I don't like? James O'Keefe. At the last election, he was following a church van around, stalking a church van because he's like, we have evidence that this group is from out of state and they're crossing the lines to vote here. And this is something that Republicans believe so deep in their bones, that the only way Donald Trump didn't win the popular vote was because millions and millions of people voted fraudulently. All right. That being said, let me see if I have this on the screen here. I want to pull up a tweet from Donald Trump. And this is what he had to say. As Americans, you need identification sometimes. This is what he tweeted this morning. As Americans, you need identification sometimes in a very strong and accurate form for almost everything you do, except when it comes to the most important thing, voting. For the people that run your country. Push hard for voter identification. Now, this is as a response to the voter commission being disbanded. And this is what he also had to say. Many mostly Democrat states refuse to hand over data from the 2016 election to the Commission on Voter Fraud. They fought hard that the commission not see their records or methods because they know that many people are voting illegally. System is rigged. Must go to voter ID. Now, this is what the president of the United States is saying, despite the fact that his voter fraud commission was rejected not only by Democratic states, but very red conservative states, including Mississippi, who's the leader of, the title of the person who the voter, I'm drawing a blank. The Secretary of State, good Lord, the Secretary of State told him and told Chris Kobach specifically to go jump in the lake, right? To go jump, not in the lake, but go jump in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is from a red state, right? So there's quite a few states who saw this voter commission fraud commission as a violation of states' rights and an infringement on people's civil liberties. And so it wasn't just Democrats who rejected this. It was also Democratic-leaning states, rather. It was also Republican states that rejected this. But this does not dispel the myth. Even though the Secretary of State of Mississippi said this, millions of people in Mississippi, particularly Republicans, believe that voter fraud is a real thing. And so what they've done historically, they've put tremendous barriers up to making it difficult for people to get the ID. First of all, you have to have an ID, but then they make it difficult for, like in Alabama, I think a great percentage of the local Department of Motor Vehicles and the local, all the places that you could register to vote or get an ID, more specifically get an ID, were shut down. And so you had to drive an hour in order to get an ID. And these DMVs that were shut down were strategically placed in black communities. Because what? They all, firmly believe that everybody who's black is voting for the Democratic Party. Well, maybe 90% of us. But anyway, so I want to, the Voter Fraud Commission was disbanded. And this has potential to make things even worse if you let Chris Kobach tell it. So on yesterday, the president, and this is according to the New York Times, the president abruptly shut down a White House voter fraud commission led by Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. President Trump said in the White House statement, quote, despite substantial evidence of voter fraud, many states have refused to provide the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity with basic information relevant to its inquiry. Rather than engage in endless legal battles and at taxpayer expense, today I signed an executive order to dissolve the commission and have asked the Department of Homeland Security to review these issues and determine the next courses of action. That last portion of it is rather concerning. And this is what Chris Kobach, not saying it out of concern for due process or concern for justice. He did this as a scare tactic to stick us in the face and say, you got rid of me, but now you have to deal with ICE, particularly the Department of Homeland Security. So turning this over to the Department of Homeland Security does potentially remove some of the transparency that was required. The fact that they were mired in litigation really slowed down their process from actually doing anything. But then the problem is like, what was there to be done? That's the whole thing here. So you had an entire commission set up in order to chase a unicorn, right? In order to chase something that is as rare as being struck by lightning. But it doesn't matter that the reality of voter fraud is rarer than cases of lightning. And this is like, when we say voter fraud, I want to make sure people understand there's two different types, right? You have voter fraud that Republicans are afraid of, which is the boogeyman, which is millions of people of going and voting in precincts that are not their own, or in states that are not their own, or illegals going to vote in states that are not their own. This is the ultimate red herring. This is the boogeyman. This is the Sasquatch, where you're always chasing, forever chasing something that doesn't exist, but you can create one hell of an industry around it. You can create so many barriers to something that doesn't exist, and this is what they have done historically. I never forget the Republican chairman in the state of Pennsylvania who got caught on tape, because he started, I mean, not even caught on tape. He said it in a speech. And in 2012, when he talked about voter identification, he expressly said, this is going to help Mitt Romney win the state of Pennsylvania. And he was like, checked it off, done. Right? So he expressly connected the voter ID efforts that were taking place in Pennsylvania, which also are taking place across the country, led by Republicans. He directly connected the purpose of those voter ID laws with electing a Republican. And this is always what it's been about. It's voter disenfranchisement. It's making it more difficult for minorities and people of color, particularly black people, who historically, at least since 1964, have been voting with the Democratic Party. And this is their way of depressing the vote, because they know if they can make the barriers of entry to voting greater and higher, then Democrats are less likely to come out. These are literally the people who stand by and cheer on rainy days on election day, because they know that it's going to depress the vote. And in a depressed vote scenario, the most angry voters are going to win. And who's the most angry all the time, no matter what. I mean, they figured out a way to be angry even after they won Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is the president, and they've still found a way to somehow be outraged at, the establishment, even though they are the damn establishment. Okay, a little bit more on this. So according to the New York Times, no state has uncovered a significant evidence to support the voter fraud that its president has alleged. In June, somewhat famously, Mississippi Secretary of State Delbert, this is what I said earlier, Delbert Holtzman said that President Trump's voter fraud commission can go jump in the Gulf of Mexico. The word I was searching for earlier was a supervisor of election. That's the one I couldn't think of, but it was actually the Secretary of State, which I stumbled onto. But supervisor of elections also have on these city by city or county by county level, they have a lot to do with this process as well. So Chris Kobach is the former Secretary of State in Kansas, and he is, for all intents and purposes, just a Donald Trump henchman. And he has, he fulfilled his duty as much as he could to try to create the specter, or to try to give legs to the specter of voter fraud. Despite all of the evidence to the contrary, they are willing to create laws to make it more difficult for you and I to vote, simply based on the specter of voter fraud, simply because they believe in it as much as people believe the earth is flat. At this point, it makes more, well, I can't say that. I was going to say, I can't even finish that. There would never be a day where I can give credence to the flat earthers. But I would say second only to the idiocy of flat earthers would be people running around here believing that there's voter fraud in any substantive fashion such that it requires laws and barriers to entry for people to vote. All right, let's take a look at what you all are saying in the comment sections about this on YouTube. The act is to fool people believing that Trump is the top of things. Imagine people thinking of their own free will. Your country is skewering you. They don't have weekend voting or ranked choice. And this is actually a great comment from Mr. Democracy. We already have barriers to entry to vote, right? We already have somewhat of a poll tax still. People having to take time off of work, people having to make accommodations to get to the voting booths on a Tuesday, right? Instead of, and this harkens back to the days where agriculture was king, right? But now, it would entirely make sense to, if you really were an advocate of democracy and not an advocate of tribalism and your team only, then you would be all for making Tuesday a holiday, a universal holiday where nobody works except for the people at the polls, almost like Christmas, which people are not going to do, or put it on the weekend so that more people can go out and vote. And ranked choice voting I think that's so far away in the conversation. Matter of fact, I know it's so far away because we're still at the point where we're trying to convince half of the voting populace that voter fraud is not actually a thing. What I was going to say earlier that I didn't say, election fraud is actually a thing. Stuffing ballots, hiding ballots, all those type of things. That actually happens, right? There are cases and litigation and people have been charged with this type of activity. And it doesn't happen at a frequency that there should be a panic, but that happens where it's a systemic level election fraud. Voter fraud puts the onus on or makes the villain out of that black person you see going to the poll. Does he really live in this community, or is he did he just get through voting in the hood and then he crossed the tracks and came over and voted in the suburbs, right? That's what voter fraud does. And that's why it's this perfect boogeyman for the Republican Party, because they can pound the drums on it without any evidence. The president of the United States is able to say these things without any evidence because we're in a post-fact America. We might be in a post-fact society, but I'm hoping this is endemic only here in America. But we're in a post-factual America where the truth does not matter. The fact that the president is able to say things that are completely unsubstantiated, right? Not only unsubstantiated, but also counter to the truth. I'm not just saying a lie, right? Because we know he lies, but we're saying we're at a point where the president can say something that is just completely unfactual, just erroneous, just blatantly untrue. Never mind his lies, his intentional lies. He stirs up these untruths and people just accept it. And they accepted this before, and I'm not going to lay this only at Donald Trump. This has been a concerted effort for a very long time. And here's, if I dare tread into the arena of the Hillary versus Bernie wars, which I am very loath to do, but I have to point this out. There were barriers to people voting during the primaries that you can go back into the catalog, and I said, you guys are laughing about these barriers to entry to vote. in the primaries, it's going to bite you in the ass in the general election. Because just because it benefited you in the sense of the harder it was to vote in a particular precinct during the primaries, or in a particular county or state during the primaries, was beneficial to Hillary Clinton. And it became something that a lot of liberals begin to celebrate and to laugh about and make jokes about. Oh, you can't get over this barrier, or you don't know how the system works. And I'm sitting back and I'm like, okay, they don't know how this system works, but the general election is coming around the corner, and you know who voter disenfranchisement helps in the general election? It helps the Republican Party. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going back into that to relitigate the Hillary versus Bernie wars, as my camera is so out of focus, but I couldn't possibly get up and go put it into focus right now. You guys are just going to have to deal with me being a little blurry today, but the audio should be solid. So if you don't like looking at a blurred image, go to Spreaker.com or iTunes and download the podcast version. All right, let's take a listen to a couple other questions. So the rest of the comments in the comment section on YouTube are pretty much telling everyone ways to avoid this and ways to make sure that this doesn't happen to you again, and to proactively go out there and work around these barriers if you have the capacity to do so. A lot of people make it seem like, oh, getting an ID is the easiest thing in the world. Let me tell you, some states it is extremely difficult to get an ID. Florida was one. I believe in Florida there was a law, if I remember correctly, and I don't want to lie, but I remember having to track down my birth certificate in Alabama and bringing that in order to renew my license, even though I had been a citizen of Florida for, since I was 14. But for me to vote in the 2012, had to be 2012. Where were we in 2012? We were in Jacksonville. So for me to vote in 2012, in the 2012 election, I had to start like 6 months before to track down my birth certificate and to track down some other information that I had to get in order to vote. And ultimately, I was able to get it done. I had to pay a lot of money to get the birth certificate, and I probably because I waited till the last minute and had to get it overnighted, but also just the cost alone, right? The cost alone, we should not have to pay money to vote. Isn't that pretty simple? A pretty simple concept, right? I should not have to pay anything to participate in this democracy. And, even the other barriers, there's certain states, I'm trying to think which state it is that is moving or attempting to move to automatic registration, right? Why not? Why not have automatic registration? Massachusetts was one of the easiest states for me to vote in when we moved from Florida to Massachusetts. It was easy as 1, 2, 3. And there was still like non-existent voter fraud. Voter fraud was non-existent. So the barriers to entry, we have to make sure that the only way we're going to change that is if we get political power. And right now, the people who have political power are creating barriers to keeping us out. So we have to play by the game. We have to get in this thing early, make sure that we're registered, make sure that we have our ID, make sure we do whatever we have to do, but then also make sure that once we get power, we put elected officials in power who are not just going to tacitly sit by and allow this to continue, but to fight against this and the broad disenfranchisement that happens all around the country, particularly in communities of color, specifically because they know and they firmly believe that African Americans are going to vote with the Democratic Party because Republicans, well, if they're not racist, they are most certainly racist adjacent. And that's just the beginning. We won't even get to the economics of it. All right. In other news, I want to bring up another image. I want to bring up an image that is freaking people the hell out. And I'm not quite sure. This image that you see on your screen is of Minnesota Democratic Representative Keith Ellison. He's also the co-chair of the DNC, and he's holding in his hand a book by Mark Bray entitled Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And in his tweet, he essentially said that this should scare, that he was in a bookstore, and that this should scare Donald Trump. It was cute, right? Cute tweet. I think Donald Trump is fascist adjacent. Fascist is a pretty specific phrase, a pretty specific thing. specific thing. So to say that he's a fascist would probably be technically wrong, but to say that he's fascist adjacent would be pretty much accurate. And so Keith Ellison tweeted this out yesterday. Fox News lost their minds. Conservatives started losing their mind. But then I started reading the comment section underneath the tweet, and there were a lot of liberals in the comment section who were like, oh, no, dude, you got to take this down. You didn't really think this thing through, did you, Keith? You know, all this kind of stuff. People lecturing him, concerned, trolling him. And I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, really? Are we, I mean, let's just take it at face value, right? No, let's get specific. This fear of Antifa, and again, I have no idea what is the correct way to say it because people around here are always saying I'm saying it wrong. I don't give a damn. Antifa, whatever. This fear of Antifa, because they are willing to use violence in order to protect people, in order to fight back against Nazis. They're Nazi punchers, and this fear of them is laughable. It's really the easiest word and the one I think is most accurate. It's laughable when you consider that the violence that has happened in 2017, let's just forget about the rest of history. Let's look at 2017. The violence that has been perpetuated, that America has been inundated with, has come from fascists, Nazis, literal Nazis taking to the streets, screaming blood and soil, screaming Jews will not replace us. I mean, running over people, plowing through an entire crowd of protesters, killing Heather Heyer. I mean, violently engaging all across this country. If you look at incidents of violence in America where people are killed, and they're killed on ideological grounds, it's generally coming from the fascist side of the equation. You have that rare incident in D.C. where this leftist from, I forgot where he was from, but he ended up shooting up the congressional baseball game practice and shooting and almost killing Steve Scalise. You know, you have that incident, but take the entirety of the year. Who has been committing the greatest acts of violence against human beings? People freak the hell out when you see the black bloc burning trash cans or burning the limousine at the inauguration, for which so many people are now on trial for, just a protest, destroying they broke a window. Oh my goodness. Ooh, I shudder at the thought. And so you have this backlash at, let's see if I pull it back up, at Keith Ellison for showing this book and laying it at the feet of Donald Trump, saying Donald Trump should be terrified. Donald Trump should be terrified. Fascists should be terrified. People who are fascist adjacent should be terrified. Just because you are not technically, as my friend Michael Tracy argued with me, Donald Trump's not technically a fascist, Ben. And I'm like, he's fascist adjacent. That's enough for me. He's supported by the Klan. He's supported by neo-Nazis. He's supported by white nationalists. He's supported by actual Nazis, right? Is that not enough for us to say, even though he's not technically a fascist, that, okay, fine. But he is definitely in the ballpark of fascism. Why are we even having this conversation? It's because of this need for liberals. This is the problem with liberals, and then there's a problem with conservatives. For liberals, there's this need to find an equivalence so that they can appear to be the center in every conversation, so that they can appear to be the moderates in every conversation. There's bad people on both sides. They talked about Donald Trump for saying this, but it was kind of curious. Actually, correct myself. They didn't call out Donald Trump for this because this is some shit that they would say, that there's bad people on both sides and there's good people on both sides in the equation between fascists and anti-fascists. I'm sorry. No, in an equation between anti-fascists and fascists, historically, we know who the bad people are. There is no equivalence between the two, but liberals and their wonderful, elitist, intellectual state of being feel more, they feel more satisfied drawing an equivalence and saying, yes, the balance to fascism is anti-fascism. The left version of what's terrible about the right is anti-fascism. And I'm like, do you even hear yourself? Have you even been paying attention to the news? Have you any clue? But it's this petulant need to always draw an equivalence that does not exist. There are bad people in the world. Doesn't mean that you're going to find bad people on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum that match and coincide with them. It doesn't. Anti-fascists are not that. Conservatives, it's a little easier to explain conservatives because it's the same exact thing that we just got through talking about in terms of voter fraud. Conservatives require a boogeyman. They cannot exist a single day without having a boogeyman. If you take Hillary Clinton, George Soros, Antifa, and just the word leftist in general out of the conservative lexicon, there is no Fox News. There is nothing for them to scare people. There is no Breitbart, and social justice warriors. Let's throw that in there for good measure. Conservatives require a boogeyman, and they will create one even when one does not exist. For example, voter fraud doesn't really exist in any significant fashion. Better chance of getting struck by lightning, but they will create the specter of this monstrous voter fraud that happens every single year, every single election. And now that's something for them to be afraid of, because the reality of it is conservatism doesn't work without a boogeyman. Conservatism doesn't work as an ideology that can just stand on its own two legs. If I was to anthropomorphize conservatism, it can't stand on its own 2 feet and just be there as solutions to the problems that we have in the world. Conservatism is a solution to imaginary problems that they have to promote on a marketing level that we've never seen before. I mean, think of the propagandistic value of Fox News. It doesn't work without terrorism. It doesn't work without the beeping red alert, news alert at the bottom of every single segment. I mean, everything's not a damn news alert. And so this is where Antifa comes into the equation. Like, this is perfect for them. You actually have leftists who do not mind using their physical bodies to defend and protect other people against fascists. And so, wow, this is perfect. They are the real boogeymen. Anti-fascists are the real fascists. Funny how that works, right? So this is the problem, and you can find both of those nicely fitted in the comment section of Keith Ellison's tweet about this. You see liberals, useless liberals. I would appreciate you and probably love you guys on other days, but days like today, you are completely useless because you are so afraid of the boogeyman that the conservatives gave you. It's either that or you just feel so much more enlightened because you can say, well, there's really bad things on both sides of the aisle. And see, here's I will go one step further. There's those people who think that is that finding the third way or finding being a moderate is the height of intellectualism, right? Barack Obama is this type of person. He really feels that the solution to the universe is found in bipartisanship. The problem with that, Barack, and I love you, but the problem with that is that when one side of the equation has gone into the realm of fascism, neo-Nazism, and tribalism on a level that no one expected, particularly in 2008, maybe 5 people, including Adolph Reed, expected that level of tribalism. But really nobody saw it coming. When the other side of the equation gets so out of balance, you can't talk about a third way. You can't talk about being a moderate to balance off this insanity that's on the right. But for people who are, I would say people who are sincere in their motivations, they honestly believe that the solution to any problem is in the middle. And so they look at the anti-fascists and they look at fascists and say both of them are wrong. the solution is in this. Oh, I thought I had something. Yeah, I'm going to share a tweet by this guy. We went to the same university in Florida, but he ended up working for, I think he's working for Share Blue now, Oliver Willis. And you know, his tweet perfectly summarizes the exact problem with liberals who think that the solution is for us to just find something in there in the middle, guys. If we find something there that's nice and moderate, everything will be okay, right? This is how they talk in my mind. This is how they think in my mind. And I'll share that with you momentarily. But this is the problem. So you have those people who do this out of habit and because they feel like it's the right thing to do. And then you have those people who do it very intentionally. I'm talking about the liberals at this point. They do it very intentionally because it's their strategy to power. It's their equation. It's their formula to power. This is the third way. And this has been the movement that has taken over and edged out leftists at least since the 70s. At least since the 70s, probably in the late 60s, but definitely in the early 70s. This has been a political path to power and an economic path to economic power. And in this regard, they're both useless. They're extremely useless because they're not equipped. They will sit back. These are the people who are in his comment section. They will sit back and allow Nazis to march in the street and think that the solution to Nazis marching in the street is for us to listen to them and for us to hear their grievances. And if we could just sit down and have a beer summit, Barack, that we can find common ground and find, but you missed the entire point. The entire point is these people, they don't want, these fascists over here, they don't want common ground with you. They want you out of their country. They want you back in Africa as though America is not your country that you go back 7 generations in. I don't know about Barack, I'm talking about me, right? So they don't want to admit that there's a certain time in diplomacy when diplomacy fails and you cannot negotiate with ideological terrorists like fascists, like the right in the United States, like conservatism, like even these you know these pleasant sounding, nice, and they're you know they have Southern hospitality or whatever. They're really nice, amenable people who are conservatives. They don't even realize that a part of their ideology is leading them closer and closer and closer to the full-blown fascism that you get from like the Daily Stormer. But these are the people that they are in league with, and we have useless liberals in the middle. I'm sorry, I just have to. I'm not trying to relitigate the primaries. This has nothing to do with Bernie versus Hillary at all. But it shows you just how useless they are to addressing the fact that one half. Well, let me narrow it down. Let me pare it down a little more. I'll get you to 33% of the voting electorate. Those 33% who are still standing behind Donald Trump. The majority of them are neatly fitted into the fascist category. And if fascist is too broad of a word and not academically accurate for you, then fascist adjacent will suffice. They are perfectly okay with the fact that the Klan endorsed their presidential candidate. They're perfectly okay with the fact that Daily Stormer, which is an arm of neo-Nazis, endorsed and supports the president. They're perfectly okay with the fact that you have dudes like, what's your boy, with the beard, with Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian Gorka has ties to Nazis and was in the White House. They have no concern, they have no regard for that because they are neatly fitted into this conservative movement. So there's 33% of the American electorate, and I'm letting off the other percentage that have now, you know, kind of waned away from Donald Trump. I'm letting them off, but at the election, they were all a part of this same group. During the election of 2016, they were all a part of the same group. And you have liberals who have no answer or no solution to the fact that almost 33% of our voting electorate are Nazi adjacent. And instead of all hands on deck addressing that, they freak the hell out about this. All right, let's see what you guys are saying in the chat room. Ronald Finkley. The Democratic Party does need some new young blood, though the fight for today's reasons, because it can't go back to how the Democrats were. The Democrats were, at least since, like I said, like the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, the Democrats have been on this headlong race towards third-way centrism. And it works for them, right? Again, I said there's a whole portion that this is political and economically expedient to do so. But then you have a fraction, I don't know what percentage, you have a fraction of people who actually believe this as an ideology. I was one of them. I was one of them. My foray into politics was Democrats and Republicans are the same, so let's find some middle ground between the two, right? That's what I was thinking, is that the answer is always in the middle. And that's not true. And then, so I say that to say that there are some people who believe this as an ideology out of the sincerity of their ignorance, right? The sincerity of my ignorance. I believe that as an ideology. But then when you really get inundated in the system, you get into the system and you see how far skewed to the right the United States of America is compared to anywhere else on the globe, you realize that the center, as advertised by the Democratic Party, is so far from the center, even on the international stage. The Democratic Party is more like the Tories more like the Conservative Party in the UK, right? The Democratic Party in the United States represents the right wing of the UK. I was right. I said Tories. That was right. But anyway, not to regurgitate that again, because we started late and I actually have to end pretty on time. Speaking of international news, I want to talk about this equal pay, the measures that, and I'm going to talk about this briefly because I have to talk about that tweet from this guy I know. But I want to talk about the measures that Iceland is going through in order to ensure that men and women have equal pay. And I think that there are lessons to be learned from this. So I'm just going to read, this is according to the New York Times. Iceland this week began putting in place a new law that requires companies and government agencies to prove that they are paying men and women equally. Pause. The best example would be, the most recent example would be Hoda, I don't know her last name, and Matt Lauer. Matt Lauer is making $13 million a year. Hoda's making now $7 million a year to replace them. Now, I know we're honestly talking about a level of elitism where it really doesn't matter. I mean, hell, pay me $1 million a year. I would not care if the person next to me is making $5 million. Pay me $1 million and we're good. But it just kind of demonstrates the imbalance that there is between men and women. And of course, there's data that bears this out. And there was a tweet chain over the holidays where a woman said, if you know that your coworker is, she said to the men, tweet out what you're making and in your position so that your coworkers can see if they're making, and it really exposed how imbalanced this thing really is. Those are just anecdotes, but there's actual data that backs this up, and Iceland has gone one step further. The Equal Pay Standard Act, companies with according to the New York Times, companies with 25 full-time employees or more must analyze their salary structures every 3 years to ensure that men and women are being paid the same amount for doing the same jobs. The New York Times continues, certification needed from the government or business will face fines. So there's actually a penalty that if you don't get this certification, that you will be fined for not being compliant with this law. In terms of the context of Iceland and gender in general, women earn 14 to 20% less than men, according to government data for 2015. In 2016, women accounted for 48% of the elected representatives in Iceland's parliament. Men were offered parental leave equal to women. I've got a baby on the way. That would be great. Icelandic law since 2013 requires private companies with more than 50 employees to have at least 40% women or men. The one in there that's nestled in there is that I think we need to address head on would be the representation, right? Women are 52% of America, and I think they represent 20% of the House. I might have my numbers wrong. But they are not equally represented in Congress. And so there is a need to have women who have our politics, clearly, right? And so this is not just a blanket saying just any woman would do, but for a long time, any man would do because it was all men in the first place. So I think as a United States, as a matter of what should just be done, particularly with the Democratic Party and leftists, is that we should be running the hell out of women to bring this into balance and to make sure that we bring it into balance with people whose politics are beneficial to women versus running women whose politics are detrimental to women, right? So we can both simultaneously address gender as well as everything else, right? It doesn't have to be a blanket. It can be very specific. Run women, yes, but run women who are going to help women instead of hurt women. And I'm trying to remember that quote from my homegirl, Anoa. She said, corporate feminism does not trickle down. I will never forget that quote she said about 2 years ago, speaking of just having representation in corporate America does not help women across the board. Same thing politically. It does not trickle down. So there is an opportunity, but there's not a shortage. Here's the thing. There's an opportunity because there's not a shortage of radical women who have politics that are beneficial to marginalized women and marginalized communities in general. There's not a shortage. I just got through listening to a podcast this morning from Left Pocket, POC, People of Color Pocket podcast. And I'm just listening to the brilliance of the host as well as the guest. And I'm like, and both of them are women. There's never going to be a shortage of dynamic women who can get the job done. What there usually is a shortage is the will to run these type of people who are dynamic. They are women and they're intersectional and they are revolutionary in the sense that they are going to do things to actually help women across all brackets, income brackets. Didn't really mean to get off on that. Last thing I want to talk about is this tweet. Because I think this perfectly summarizes the impending doom of the Democratic Party. I swear that it's like the Democratic Party, if you guys listen to people like this, I swear to God, it's coming to an end sooner rather than later. And the problem is we absolutely need, we need to get some winners. This is Oliver Willis. He works for Share Blue, quasi-public figures. He said, I am normal human person. I am a normal human person. I do not believe in 24/7, 365 existential drama. I promise that I will support policies and ideas like a normal human and not subject your family to a roller coaster of emotion on the regular. And then he said, this is how the 2020 Democratic nominee should introduce herself. 1,200 likes, 338 retweets. Let me tell you something. You guys can run that shit if you want to. That would be the end of the Democratic Party. When in any other scenario, this should be a blue wave coming up. In any other scenario. And it's not just what he said specifically, but generally that thought process that the article from Politico that said that what America really wants is someone boring and bland like Doug Jones. Doug Jones, who I just read a headline before the show started, who is now saying that it's going to be a tug of war between Democrats and the GOP to get his vote. Doug, get your stuff together, man. I mean, just because you won this time don't mean you got 6 years. Yes, congratulations. But you will be forgotten about in the next 6 months if you keep carrying yourself like this. But I digress. The point is this idea that the antidote to Donald Trump is some lifeless automaton who's going to say, I am a normal human being. You know, the antidote to Donald Trump is being kind. No. Do you understand that Hillary Clinton would have won if she had politically eviscerated and disemboweled Donald Trump in the primaries? The antidote to Donald Trump is someone as bold and brash as Donald Trump, but with the intelligence of fill in the blank of your favorite intellectual. Like someone who can expose in a laughable way how imbecilic this moron is. right? Someone who's going to appeal to the anger that is in America on the left in general, even in the Democratic Party. Hell, the Democrats don't even want someone as bland as Doug Jones. We only voted for Doug Jones to keep out a pedophile. Come on, man. You guys can't really be this stupid, can you? And I really have to ask a question. Are you guys really this dumb, or are you sincerely tied up into your economic advantage that you get from forwarding these imbecilic ideas? Like there's consultants who get paid good money to do this. You're getting paid good money to help people lose. I mean, come on. Seriously? You honestly think that, do you know what Donald Trump would do to a Doug Jones on the national stage? He at the end of it, he said herself, right? So he's referring to a woman. I'm trying to think of thankfully, I don't really know if I could think of a woman who is as boring as Doug Jones. You know, that's the solution. I mean, that's the good news, right? You're usually going to get a firebrand when you get a woman. You're not going to get some, meandering, navel-gazing, spineless, blob of an automaton, thankfully. So if you get a woman, maybe you'll get somebody, but that was the problem with Hillary. Hillary's main problem was that she did not take Donald Trump out. And everybody I swear to God, if you go back to the debate where he was stalking her from behind, he was just hovering over her, and all she did was turn around and looked at him. If you go back to that debate and Hillary Clinton just politically and disemboweled that fool in front of the entire country, if she was not afraid, and I'm going to use a word here because I think it fits here in the conversation, but I generally don't use this. She was afraid because generally Americans are afraid of women coming off as a bitch, right? And so Hillary Clinton was crafting everything that she could to avoid being seen as Queen Bee. But up against Donald Trump, everybody in their living rooms would have shouted to the top of their lungs if Hillary Clinton had came out and just made him look like the impotent little man-child that he is. And so the solution to Donald Trump is not someone bland and boring who said, I am a normal human being. That's not the solution to Donald Trump. And if you think that's the solution, I hope you lose your job as a consultant, because really America needs you to lose your job. I hope there's an entire swath of political consultants out there who are going to be homeless. I don't care. Go and experience the third way solution to homelessness, because you don't need to be employed. You don't need to be employed, because America absolutely needs us to get past this Trump administration, and we will not do it if all we have are consultants, political consultants, who think the solution to fascism is to be a nice person and a calm person. Let's see if I can do this the right way. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog, join the Progressive Army, and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. It's Ben Dixon! If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.
Consider becoming a Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show.